You know, one of the things I love about the autumn and the winter time is that cool, fresh, crisp air that you get on a clear sunny day like today, which is rare for us here in the Pacific Northwest. And, you know, I think a lot of herbalists sometimes maybe get a little bit sad when the autumn season rolls around, winter rolls around, because, you know, we're not really out in the garden too much. We're not really harvesting too much. It's kind of our downtime in a way as herbalists. And that's why I also really love our evergreen materia medica. You know, the way that these trees, the evergreen life, and the way that that medicine is abundantly available for us all year around is a really special thing. And these types of trees have a lot of medicine that's really good for us in these winter months. And so while we've done some content in the past talking about some more of the folklore around evergreens, especially in their kind of association in a lot of the holiday traditions that pop up across the world around the winter time, thought I would take some time today to share a little bit about more of the medicinal virtues and properties of our evergreen medicines. Hey, what's up everybody? Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and welcome to a little discussion here on evergreens. So, you know, when we're looking at the evergreen materia medica, we're really looking at a pretty broad range of medicinal trees. And that ranges anywhere from the pines, the spruces, the hemlocks, the firs, the cedars. There's a whole lot of different evergreen trees out there all across the world. But what we see is that a lot of them display very similar medicinal properties. So I'm kind of lumping them all together, which is not something I tend to do. But really, for the most part, a lot of these herbs have a lot of crossover properties. So I'm going to be speaking to them in relatively general terms here. Each one sometimes has some unique specificities about it. But we're just going to be discussing kind of some of those evergreens in general here. So what we see almost universally across these trees, you know, for the most part, we're using, you know, the green leafy material, the needles, the brush basically, and that's not exactly, of course, the technical botanical term for it, but we're using the leaves. And what we see pretty much across the board with all of these trees is they have a very nice, distinct, pungent, aromatic flavor to them. And that is because pretty much all of these have within them volatile oils, right? These are very terpene-rich trees, meaning that the plant is producing these volatile aromatic essential oils actually as part of that tree's innate immune system. Really, it's a defense mechanism. If we think, you know, here in the Pacific Northwest, it's super damp all of the time. And, you know, unfortunately up here, a lot of the old growth has been logged because logging is one of the major industries here in the Pacific Northwest. But, you know, we've seen, you know, some stumps, unfortunately, only the stumps, but from, you know, very, very old Western red cedars that, you know, literally are like 20 feet in diameter. I mean, they're absolutely huge. If you think about that, a tree that can live to grow that large, live for hundreds and hundreds of years in an incredibly damp environment, it has to be able to protect itself from things like fungi, from bacteria, from things that will eat away at the wood and ultimately kill the tree. And so pretty much universally, the evergreens all produce these very nice, distinct aromatic volatile oils that are very terpene rich. Alpha pinene, beta pinene, alpha and beta philandrine. There's lots of different constituents in these plants, but universally these all have a very nice antiseptic, antimicrobial action. And so that's one of the main ways that these trees are used as kind of like a general broad spectrum antiseptic. When we're looking at the affinities of these plants, though, most of them have a very strong affinity for the upper respiratory tract. You know, the throat, the bronchioles, the lungs, down into the lower respiratory tract. Some I find get a little bit deeper than others, but the respiratory tract is really one of the primary affinities for these trees. And if we couple that respiratory tract affinity with it being an antiseptic, right, we have a very nice combination of an herb that is typically used to treat respiratory tract or respiratory route infections. And this is how cross-culturally, evergreens have been used all across the world for this purpose very, very effectively. So the respiratory tract is what I see as the primary affinity for these herbs. Some of our trees, I mean, they're herbs, you know, we use them medicinally. For some reason, sometimes trees and herbs, we think of herbs as like, you know, plants as distinct from trees, but it's an herb. And so we do see other affinities for some other evergreens, especially things like the junipers tend to have a very strong affinity for the kidneys and the urinary tract, also having antiseptic properties there. We also would say that some of these have a bit of an affinity for the immune system. And this I'm really thinking oftentimes in terms of like, especially like the fresh fir tips. At least that's what we have here in the Northwest. We got tons of Douglas fir here in the forest. And in the springtime, you get those really bright green fir tips are extremely rich in vitamin C. So while pungency is really the main flavor profile for a lot of these remedies, the fresh growth actually has a very distinct sour flavor to it. Very, very rich in vitamin C. They're really, really tasty. Like fir tip tea is really nice. Now, vitamin C is a polysaccharide, and it's said that you know, really, really hot water kind of denatures that property. So, you know, I like to just eat them, you know, eat the fir tips while you're walking through the forest. You get a nice, kind of freshens your breath up and, you know, gives you a really nice dose of vitamin C, along with all of the other bioflavonoids that are going to be present, right? We got to remember vitamin C is not just ascorbic acid. That's a very reductionistic way of thinking about it. We have to remember that ascorbic acid is really much more active when it's present with all of the host of other bioflavonoids that go along with it in nature, the way nature intended. So respiratory tract, urinary tract, and because they're volatile oil rich, many of them will probably warm the gut, bring a little bit of a carminative effect. That's not typically how they're used, but you know, most things with volatile oils will be slightly carminative for the digestive system, as well as warming circulation a little bit. And that's going to really vary depending on how pungent and kind of hot and spicy and aromatic those volatile oils are. So when we're thinking about the actions, right, I mentioned carminative, slightly circulatory stimulant, but the main one here is these are great expectorant remedies. So when we're thinking volatile oils, typically will have an affinity for the respiratory tract. This is because as soon as they enter your mouth, which is a warm environment, those constituents are volatile, right? They want to float around in the air. So you put those herbs in your mouth, whether that's through a tea or through a tincture, you know, some of those volatile constituents are going to remain in your mouth. You take a breath and you're going to breathe them right into your lungs. And because they're pungent and warming in nature, they're going to have much more of a stimulant expectorant effect. So we're going to see these plants being very, very nice for, or trees, being very nice for typically cold, damp, phlegmatic, stagnant, kind of stuck respiratory tract conditions. Really, really nice for a cough. Some of them are very nice at kind of opening up the lungs. Like when folks sometimes have hard time breathing, it's just kind of, it's like that kind of, they're not antispasmodic in my experience with them, but they do kind of seem to have this opening effect. And I think that's because volatile oils in general have this up and outward movement. They tend to kind of expand and radiate. They kind of open things up. When things get too cold and damp, the vital force moves down and in. And the volatile oils are kind of the opposite of that, right? So warming and drying in their energetic property here. And some might consider them to be stimulant in their effect as well, just because they are so warming and they drive circulation a little bit and things like that. So those are kind of some of the main properties that I tend to think of with the evergreens in terms of internal use. Now, these trees also have a very rich tradition in terms of their topical usage. And that is kind of brings up an action I guess I don't really talk about that much, but that is as a rubefacient. And rubefacient is another term, like a synonym for it would be a counter irritant. So the way a counter irritant works is this is a topical action, and so when you apply a counter irritant or a rubefacient topically, oftentimes it's actually essentially it's stimulating the local blood flow. So it's opening up all of the capillary beds, it's bringing blood flow to the surface, and typically that is used as a means for relieving pain. Oftentimes kind of cold, damp, stagnant type pain, where there's a lack of blood flow and circulation, and therefore, metabolic waste products are going to be much more prone to accumulate in that area, triggering an inflammatory response. There's swelling, damp accumulation, things get kind of tight and stiff, and then those counter irritants kind of bring fresh blood flow, fresh oxygen. In that fresh blood flow, you're kind of cleaning the area out of metabolic waste products that are quite likely leading to an inflammatory triggering. So these are really great counter irritants. I remember we have a really good friend that's from Finland, and so she's always talking about their tradition of the saunas and how sauna is like this huge thing in their tradition, and they would actually take certain evergreens and kind of in a way like flagellate themselves in the way you think of kind of stinging yourself with nettles. Well, they would do that with their specific species. I can't remember off the top of my head what species it was, but evergreens, and kind of hitting themselves with it, and you're delivering all of those volatile oils to the skin, bringing blood flow. Of course, while in a sauna, the pores are open, so you're going to be receiving those chemical constituents very readily. So I think that's a really kind of an interesting traditional way that the evergreens are used. Now, my preferred way of using them is I use tinctures a lot. And so I find that many of these evergreens prepare very nicely as tinctures. I personally prefer to utilize them fresh. This is because I find that fresh herbs tend to yield a more aromatic extraction when they're done fresh, as opposed to being extracted dry. This is simply because by virtue of drying, when you dry an aromatic herb, if you walk into the space and smell that herb, there's all of your volatile constituents floating around in the air that you're essentially losing out on and not going to be present in the medicine. So I personally really love these as fresh tinctures because they're very terpene rich. I typically will use a higher percentage alcohol for them. So anywhere between 70 to 80% alcohol, I find makes a very nice volatile, aromatic, stimulant expectorant, circulatory stimulating, antimicrobial property. Now, one of the things specifically to the Western red cedar is that the Western red cedar, which is Thuja plicata, that we've got in quite abundance here in the Pacific Northwest, I use a lot as a fungal remedy. So it's really, really great in the treatment of especially one thing that we see really common here, especially like I live kind of in the Bellingham area, which is a college town, and I can't tell you how many houses in that area were like college houses. They can't afford to keep the heat on very much, so the houses are really cold. It's really damp here, and black mold's a huge issue. So a lot of people end up with living in moldy houses with black mold. They get these really nasty respiratory tract infections and coughs that really don't go away very easily and don't respond that great to a lot of typical kind of respiratory tract remedies that we usually tend to think of using. And I have found the Western red cedar is like the best, hands down. I'm always a big proponent of local herbs for local people. I think we are all exposed to similar environmental conditions. Obviously, we live in the same ecosystem. And so for that specific situation, I've actually used Western red cedar a lot for people with respiratory route issues due to being exposed to fungi, yeasts, molds, kind of environmentally in the home. And it's surprisingly common up here, actually, and it can make people really, really unwell. So that's one way that I've used the Western red cedar, and I typically am using that as a tincture. Another great way to use these herbs, because they're volatile oil rich, is diffusing them. And of course, in our modern kind of essential oil crazed, I guess, world, a lot of people use these as straight essential oils, which is nice. You know, I think these are good remedies to use as volatile oils. I'm not typically a huge proponent of using straight essential oils, but these ones, because they're so renewable, they're so abundant, I think these are remedies that actually do work well as essential oils. So whether that's placing them in an essential oil diffuser to diffuse those oils throughout the home, or there's, you know, the more, I guess, personalized diffusion, which is great for the treatment of respiratory tract conditions, which is the old tent trick. You know, you get a pot of water, you get yourself a blanket, you know, and or a towel, and you drape that over, and you just breathe the steam in, and you could put some of the volatile oil in there and inhale that steam. And the other thing, the way I like to do it, which is a little bit more of a folky way, I guess, probably not nearly as concentrated as that, but we heat our home with wood fire, right? And so we've always got the wood stove cooking. And for any of you that live in a wood-fired heated home, it can tend to really dry the air out. And so it's really nice sometimes to put a pot of water on the stove to just get a little bit of moisture in the air so you don't get too dried out. Well, what we like to do is we like to put evergreen branches in there. So we'll put cedar and fir and spruce and hemlock and just put those evergreens in our pot of boiling water on the stove, and it makes the house smell really nice and pleasant and inviting, but it also does provide a degree of that antiseptic effect. Of course, it's not going to be nearly as probably potent or strong as diffusing straight essential oil. So I like that just as like a general kind of keep the air clean and fresh. But if someone's really like in an acute situation, typically I think doing the tent trick as a steam is a really nice way to apply these volatile oils. And then of course we get into the topicals. So using the essential oils are great additions for your kind of joint pain based salves, anti-inflammatory salves, any type of topical preparation that you're wanting to use to provide some pain relief. Man, using these essential oils is a great way to administer them. They're very, very effective through that rubefacient counter-irritant property, providing some analgesic pain relieving effect, and of course, a nice added benefit of it makes your salve smell really, really nice. And so I've used typically things like poplar buds. We've got a lot of poplar trees, or the balm of Gilead, those resinous buds that you can pick. Also a nice winter harvest plant or tree here in the Northwest. That's typically like January, February. It kind of depends on the weather and the temperature when those buds are good to harvest. But that makes a very nice infused oil that is a base for a salve. It's rich in salicylates and anti-inflammatory compounds for joint pain. Combining that with things like fir oil, spruce oil, cedar, all those evergreen essential oils, it makes for a really nice kind of, for us here in the Northwest, a nice locally sourced topical salve. And of course there's stronger remedies that you can put in there that can be a little bit dangerous. You know, I know some herbalists here that use like the hellebore or false hellebore in very small amounts. They're very, very careful about it for arthritic pain. So I'm not recommending that. That hellebore is a very dangerous herb. You got to really know how to use that one. But that's another local plant here in the Northwest people use for a topical for the treatment of a lot of joint pain and arthritic conditions. So that's just a little bit about some of the evergreens, you know. Like I said, going into the late autumn here, winter time, it's kind of nice to know of some remedies that we can still work with, that we can still pick and utilize fresh. And they are just so abundant and wonderful to work with because they are available. And I feel like there's symbolism with these plants that I think is really, or these trees, I keep saying plants, these trees, that's also really powerful, where, you know, a lot of cultures view the evergreens as a representation of kind of like everlasting life, of like life continuing to go on, you know, moving into the winter as all the other plants are kind of dying back and going into their roots. All the other trees are dropping their leaves. Everything's kind of coming to a phase of rest and dormancy. Here we have these trees that still have that green, that evergreen life within them. And they're highly revered cross-culturally all over the world for that reason. And I think that's one of the reasons why in the winter time, around the holiday seasons, why oftentimes the greenery of these evergreens are brought into the home, right? It's a sign, a symbol of like life will return, spring will come, the earth and nature the cycle will continue to turn. There will be that replenishment and rejuvenation that happens in nature. And I think that's also a sign for us of our own internal, you know, cycles and rhythms that we go through, that there's times for that dormancy and that hope that that life will return to the earth and spring will come again, the sun will rise, you know. I think there's just some really beautiful symbolism in the medicine of the evergreens. And we've got another post that we'll put in the description below, talking a little bit more about the folklore around some of those evergreens brought into the home. Especially like things like mistletoe. That's a very different herb medicinally. I'm kind of speaking more about the evergreen trees here, but mistletoe, another really potent, powerful evergreen with lots of rich symbolism around it. Very different medicinal properties for sure than what we're talking about here. And the hollies, of course, being used a lot there too. So anyways, there's another post on that. It's a written article on that from actually one of our team members here at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. So we'll put a link to that down there in the description. It's a super interesting article if you're curious a little more about the folklore of evergreen. So thanks so much for tuning in to this video. If you're watching this or listening to this anywhere but our website, head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com, where we've got tons of free resources and mini courses and all of our blog posts and everything like that. Hit the like and subscribe button if you're on YouTube. It really helps support the channel. You know, it really enables us to continue to produce free content for the herbal medicine community, which we spend most of the year doing. Actually, a majority of our work here is actually producing free content for everyone. So it's a really simple way that you can help support the work that we're doing, support the channel. Like, subscribe. Be sure to check us out on our podcast at The Plant Path as well. And if you haven't yet, leave us a good comment and review on there. That also is a great way to help support our channel. Sometimes people ask us, how can we support if we can't afford to do a full paid program? Well, liking and subscribing and leaving good feedback is a great way to do that. So thanks again so much for joining me here. I'm Sage Popham, and until the next time, take care and be well.